Shabbat Shalom. Time for a little review. Part 3 of the sermon series. Don't worry, this is the last part. But we've been building up to this. If you've been coming or watching on YouTube, like and subscribe for the last couple weeks, you will know where we're going. We have been talking about this tension of crying out, of praying on Shabbat. Anybody want to give me a quick summary of what that tension is? Why might we not want to cry out on Shabbat? All right. We usually do not want to make personal requests on Shabbat. This is not a time of bakashot, of those requests, of those petitions. That's the other 6 days of the week. Don't worry, you've got plenty of time for it. But on Shabbat, we are trying to move ourselves to see ourselves as not demanding more, as not requesting more, but to actually appreciate the world, ourselves, our life as it is. The same way that God rested on that seventh day, we should rest not only from our labor, but also from our striving. Excellent. Turn to page 176. 176 of your Siddur. Pam, 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 pam. What are the first two words? 176. Yakum porkan min shemaya. That doesn't sound like Hebrew. It's Aramaic. Absolutely. Give that man a gold star. You can trade it in somewhere else. It's Aramaic. Aramaic is a sister language to Hebrew. In fact, it was the lingua franca for the ancient Middle East for a very, very long time. It is akin to Hebrew the same way you might say that Portuguese and Spanish are very similar, but just because you know one doesn't mean you know the other. You'll be able to make some embarrassing mistakes, but you still should learn the other language. Aramaic was actually used in the Jewish community more than Hebrew for some of the centuries of our people's existence. The same way that English is used in this country more than Hebrew for average Jewish communication. As such, the rabbis wanted to write some prayers in Aramaic in order that they be more accessible to the entirety of the community. The most famous, of course, is the Kaddish, which is also written in Aramaic, and the Be'ana Rachetz page that we recite earlier in the Torah service. Those are all Aramaic compositions. Yakum Porkan, however, is not as pristine as those two compositions. It has gone through many different amendments over the thousands of years that we have been reciting this. When it began by mentioning the Reish Galuta. There's another good Aramaic phrase that has fallen out of favor. Don't worry, I'll give you the English translation, the exilarch. That helped a lot, right? The exilarch. Okay, exilarch you guys can figure out. Come on, let's do our root words, right? Exil as in exile, and arch as in tetrarch, monarch, oligarch, somebody in charge, right? The ruler. So, an exilarch was the formal secular ruler in charge of the Jewish community in the Babylonian region during the period of the composition of the Talmud and the Geonim. And the exilarch at different times had more or less power within his community, within the Jewish world as a whole. And the rabbis considered it judicious to put a blessing for the exilarch at this point in the service. Now, going back to what we have talked about crying out on Shabbat, why might they have thought that a blessing of the exilarch would be a good idea, even though it's Shabbat and we're not supposed to make petitions? For the community. It's not just because we want him to be comfy. Trust me, the exilarch was always comfy. There's a lot of tension about his own wealth and sometimes arrogance, depending upon who was in that office. It was a hereditary-ish position. But we knew that his ability to serve the community was important. He was the first line in communication with the non-Jewish authorities, who were the actual archs of the country. After all, the exilarch had no dominion, no sovereignty within the Babylonian world, but he did have a great deal of influence with those that did. Therefore, his success was our success. Makes a lot of sense, right? Unfortunately, if you no longer live among the exilarch's domains, and no one does at this point, although it would be fun to see if someone wanted to resurrect the exilarch as a position. I can just imagine the controversy of who would get to wear that crown. If you don't have an exilarch, then we should get rid of the prayer, shouldn't we? But what does Yukum Purkan and the Hebrew prayer that comes at the bottom of the page do instead? Who instead is the focus of these prayers on this page? The whole community. You see, we cut out the middleman to save you on the result. Right? It's a beautiful cut out the middleman kind of technology. If we're not going to have an exilarch, but we still are interested in the needs of the community, then we can just pray for the community directly rather than praying for some pseudo-sovereign that wears fancy clothes. Makes sense, right? But it's still Shabbat. Yes, we're praying for the needs of the community, but look at the people, especially in the bottom paragraph, that are being listed as those whom we are calling out by name or by role in the community specifically. What are some of the jobs that they are fulfilling? Providing for the synagogue through such things as, they build the synagogue, and what else did they do? It's right there on the page. It's not cheating to read. Bringing bread and kiddush, bringing bread and wine for the community. Other examples, please. This is the easy one to answer because it's right there in front of you. What's that? Sheltering the homeless. Tzedakah for the poor. Thank you. We're getting the idea now. Binyan Eretz Yisrael be'emunah. Those who are building up, revitalizing the land of Israel faithfully. Or we can just lump it together, Tzorchei Tzibur, those that are involved in the needs of the community. But there's a problem. We're back into our tension that we've talked about for the last 2 weeks. I mean, yes, these things kind of need to be done, but the people who are doing them don't actually need to be doing them. So can we pray for them on Shabbat if they're not actually the will of the community? Let me explain. It's a little confusing because all of us are mostly contaminated by Western culture to more or less degrees. In Judaism, when we talk about the commandments, we actually mean them as, commandments. The word mitzvah, before it was mutated in Yiddish speak, doesn't mean good deed. It means obligation. It means that you are commanded to do something, an order from a higher power, quite literally. And that means that every time you wake up in the morning, you wake up in debt. That is the term that is used in Hebrew. You have a chiyuv. You have an obligation. You owe God. You owe the fulfillment of the commandments. When you wake up, you are obligated. You are already in debt. You are in the red to recite the Shema twice that day. And when you have recited the Shema for the second time, the term that's used in Hebrew is you are yotzei. You have exited your obligation. You have zeroed out that balance in the bookkeeping of your obligations. Everybody following this? I know it's a very counter-American position to imagine ourselves born into debt when we think that we're born into freedom. But trust me, Judaism highlights obligation and responsibility not as a burden, but as a tool for driving ourselves forward in the world rather than the alternative. So, if we have a chiyuv to recite the Shema, to not eat something that isn't kosher, to study Torah, all of those are perfectly fine. But who has the chiyuv? Who has the obligation to establish a synagogue? Is that an individual obligation? Is Mr. Joe Shapiro over there personally responsible for making sure that there is a synagogue in his community? Technically, no. Joe doesn't have that burden on his shoulders. He is not under that chiyuv, under that obligation. Who is responsible for establishing a school? who is responsible for ensuring there is a public recitation of the Torah or the conducting of public services. We may have a chiyuv to pray, but we do not individually have an obligation to ensure that there will be a place to pray in, or that there will be people who can fulfill the duties of those prayers within those places. If each one of us was technically just closeted away in our own homes, doing our own Shabbat services, we would still be ticking the box for exiting that obligation on that Shabbat. But what would happen to the community? Our ancestors recognized in this prayer that the community is not just a collection of individuals who have an obligation to do something. It recognized that there is a very special manifestation of the will of the community that is not actually being forced. I know many of us feel an obligation. We have to help the synagogue. And I'm not telling you not to feel that way. Trust me. I want you to feel that way, but I want you to understand that feeling that way is different than feeling like I need to recite the Shema. Feeling like you need to recite the Shema is indeed because God said, you, Mr. Joe Shapiro, need to recite the Shema. That obligation is yours. You're not allowed to lay it down. Absolutely not. It is a commandment. But the obligation to support a congregation, to learn how to daven, to work in the kitchen, to be in the office, to be in our garden, there isn't actually a personal obligation on each of us to do that. And yet we feel that call. Yet we feel that pull. We feel that, well, I have to. Not because I'm commanded, but because of what Torah has taught me, what my family has taught me, what my community has taught me. I can't imagine living a different way. Yes, I have other needs and competing things that I must do in my life, my family, my work, other parts of the community, but I am going to make sure that I help this congregation to the best of my ability with whatever talents, whatever energy, whatever resources I have at my disposal. Not because I am obligated by the commandments directly, but because if I don't, who will? If I don't, there won't be a place to gather for prayer. There won't be food for the Kiddush and wine for Kiddush. There won't be a place for those that are in desperate need to gather, to find comfort, to find community, to find strength. But that's your choice. It is a beautiful choice, and I applaud it. It is one of the reasons I came to Temple Israel, because I saw a community that was imbued with that passion, that knew that this was not a Jewish world that would be sustained simply by funding professional staff, which unfortunately has been the model in some other places that I have happened to visit. Instead, this congregation recognizes that Judaism happens not because we feel browbeaten by obligation, but because we feel inspired by the calling. And each of us will find our own niche, our own way to help. And it might change at different times in our life. It might change in different seasons of the year. But we still will answer that call to the best of our ability. That is what this page 176 is remarking on, and how it can violate the normal prohibition on Shabbat of making a petition, to make a petition on behalf of those who have assumed that obligation, not because they were commanded individually, but because they are dedicated to us as a collective, as a community, that they willingly step into those holes, those breaches, those needs, and say, I'll take care of it. This congregation could not exist without that, nor can any others endure without that. I feel sorry for other communities that do not have the same level of passion and commitment of the rank and file membership. They cannot have hundreds of people who help throughout a year to make sure the congregation can still be a congregation. And I am incredibly proud of this congregation continuing to rise to that idea of voluntarism, that idea that I may not be obligated personally, but I'll be damned if it doesn't get done just because I didn't want to help. That passion is what makes Temple Israel unique in Central Florida, and it is what is going to guarantee our future. Shabbat Shalom.